Hello and welcome to the talk about AssetDatabase.Refresh and what happens when you refresh the Asset database. I would like to give you an overview of the things we'll be looking at today. First thing is just a small intro to the new Asset database. Then we'll talk about what happens when you actually refresh. We have this new feature called Fast Platform Switch, so I'll get into that and share some of the ideas behind it. Then we'll talk about the tips and tricks of the Asset database. And finally, I'll have some time for question and answer, if time permits. Before we do that, just a little bit about me. I've been making video games since 2004, anywhere from PlayStation 2 down to the latest handheld devices. But I've been with the Asset Pipeline team for just over a year now. And it's been a learning process, which I want to share with you today. So let's get started. We have rewritten the Asset database while maintaining API compatibility with version 1. This means that your projects should have no issue with API changes. We have also updated the API reference to have more code examples, as well as a better manual as well. When rewriting the Asset database, we had some guiding principles, which are determinism, dependency tracking, and deterministic importers. We'll get into these as well. So we have also rewritten the cache server. I won't go into too much detail about it, but I will keep referring back to it, saying that there are some improvements that you will find in the new cache server that are compatible with the new Asset database. One thing that, for those of you that are quite interested in asset management in general, it's that the new cache server supports dynamic dependencies. That's one of the biggest changes that we have for it. I would like to talk about some of the terms that I'll be using throughout this presentation as well. First one being import results and artifacts. So for those of you that have looked inside the library folder in your Unity projects, you may have seen this artifacts folder, and then some maybe 255 folders with just two-letter names, right? Basically, what those two-letter names are is the first two letters of a file. This is the file that we import. This is the import result. So you take your PNG, and we eventually have, this is the GUID, at least in the previous Asset database, but that's maybe not so important right now. And you can have multiple of these files in your project. So that's kind of like what the library, the artifacts folder is comprised of. So when I say import results, it's these files. And also the terms will be interchangeable as well throughout the presentation. Then I want to talk about hashing in the context of the Asset database, which is we will take an arbitrary data stream and we'll produce a 128-bit hash from that. You have some bytes, then you run it through some hashing function that we have, and out comes a 128-bit hash. And we do this in many places throughout the Asset pipeline. Next thing is dependencies. So these are things that we identify as something that can have an effect on the import result. Meaning these, in this example, these three things and some others, we mark them as dependencies, and then we import, and we have an import result. So it's not just your asset, it's your asset plus some additional dependencies that get imported and are part of the import result. Then we also have dependency tracking, which essentially says, did something change? And if something changed, propagate that change throughout the import pipeline, the asset pipeline, towards the final import result. We have static and dynamic dependencies, but we'll get into those just in a little bit. Then comes determinism, and our first code example of the day. So we want to make sure that whenever you have the same input, we always give you the same output. That's determinism in a nutshell. So for example, I have a function here. And I've called it non-deterministic because, sure, you can call it one time, and it will produce something. But if you call it 2 times in a row with the same input, you're actually going to get a different result. And that's because move asset is trying to move something from path 1 to path 2. However, when something exists at path 2, it's going to fail and say, hey, I can't do this. So that's when we have this different result from calling the same function with the same input just 2 times in a row. So one way to fix the determinism of this is to think, okay, let's make sure that our target destinations don't exist. Let's make sure we create the assets, and we can then move what we want to where we want it to move. And when we give it the same input, we'll have the same output time and time again. Next thing are deterministic importers. So we would like to ensure that whenever you import an asset, given the same dependencies, the result is the same. And it should be the same across machines, which is very important for caching data remotely. If I'm developing a game on my PC and somebody is developing their game on their PC, we should have the same result. Otherwise, we're going to get conflicts when we import. And that's going to, well, if there's conflicts, it's going to lead to a reimport. And it's non-deterministic. So this is kind of like what I'm talking about. So now the asset database. It's split up into 2 databases. You can find them in the library folder in Unity 19.3. We have the source asset database, and we have the artifact database. These are memory mapped files, memory mapped databases that are transactional, so it's much more difficult to corrupt them. And this is chosen on purpose so that we reduce the amount of corruption that happens in the asset pipeline. So ideally, you would have to not delete your library folder. Fingers crossed. All right, so source asset database. That contains information about your source assets. The last modified date, 128-bit hash of your source file, GUIDs, other meta information. This is all in memory, so we don't have to go down to the file system and request when was last modified time. And we don't have to rehash it every time we want to get something. So we're caching this in memory. Then we have the artifact database. This contains the dependency information for the imports, the meta information for the artifacts, a list of artifact file paths, a list of things we put in the library, such as info files. If you've seen info files in the past, well, they are essentially the file that we save out when you have a preview of an asset. So we have a texture stored in these info files that you could potentially get and see what the preview looks like without having to click on the asset to get the preview. And we also have res files in there. So now we are ready for refresh. So what is a refresh? Well, there are 4 ways that we can trigger a refresh in Unity, more or less. Auto refresh through the menu item, or a shortcut, Control-R, from scripts, and finally, some APIs. So let's talk about these a little bit. So there's auto refresh, and this is actually the only special refresh that we have, because it's triggered by the operating system. Whenever you tab in and out of Unity, we get a window focus event. And that's on the C++ native layer. That means we can do a few different things from if you were to invoke it via C#. So this is the only way to get forced synchronized script compilation, meaning that we will not continue until all the scripts are compiled and then continue with the import process. Whereas using assets refresh, that comes from managed C# code. Just when you do Control-R, or you just select the item. The same thing with calling C# AssetDatabase.Refresh from C#. And we have other various API calls which trigger our internal refresh. But when you do that, they have internal filters that only limit a refresh to those particular assets. So for example, when you call create asset, that will generate an internal refresh with these filters. Same for importing asset. So the phases of when you actually call AssetDatabase.Refresh are scanning, scan the file system, categorizing assets, compiling the scripts, importing the assets that are not scripts, and a final call to post-process all assets. So let's have a look at each one. When we scan for changes, we're essentially enumerating the files in the assets folder. We detect changed files. These would be added, modified files. But we also have a list in memory that says, these are the files we expect to be there, and they are not present in the enumeration, which means they were deleted. Once we have these files that we have detected, then we make a hash of the content of these files. So in this example, you have the first file is all good. Second file, something changed, so we need to rehash it. Third file is fine. We also enumerate the packages folder, but there's one difference with that, which is we only do it one time, because we consider packages as immutable. As maybe some of you have found out when trying to edit some code in a package, it's set to read only. So we say, these things are not supposed to be edited, therefore we only do it one time. As you can see with the picture. So yes, we have the, all right, yeah. Then, for those of you that may be more performance-oriented, you could see that if you have a very large file structure, it could take a long time to enumerate all the files in your project. Tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, even millions of files. That scales up. So there's an upcoming feature at a talk by one of my colleagues tomorrow, which is called Speed Up Your Asset Imports for Big Projects, where he will talk about the new directory monitor feature that will be coming up soon, which is essentially the operating system telling us what changed rather than us asking what has changed. So now that we have scanned, we also need to categorize assets. We need to know what things have changed. So we need to see if things are up to date. Maybe the asset didn't change, but something that it depends on changed. And that's when we split that up by source code and source assets. Your C# scripts, DLLs, all those source-related files, they get put in the source code category, and the rest, your models, your textures, your audio files, they are source assets. And we need to have this split between the two, because the code that is written may affect the way that things are imported. And we also have to be able to match an asset through static dependencies or dynamic dependencies. So now let's look at what those are. Static dependencies are things that we know ahead of time. These are things such as the name of your asset, the ID of the importer associated with this asset. Usually it's by extension. You have an FBX extension associated to the model importer. You have the PNG related to the texture importer. And you can also have scripted importers, and those, maybe you're changing, maybe you can change between importers to what you want to do. And then we have the importer version. So this is when you change enough of your importer to say, hey, I need to force a re-import of every asset associated with this. We also know this ahead of time. Finally, the build target. And knowing the build target ahead of time allows us to do fast platform switch, which I'll talk about later. Dynamic dependencies, these are things we don't know ahead of time. So for example, let's take a nested prefab. As you may all be familiar with what this is, we got prefab 3 containing prefab 2, and prefab 2 contains prefab 1. When you look at prefab 3.prefab, among many things, it contains a game object and a prefab instance. But there's already something that's missing here. There's no reference to prefab 1. But either way, we say, OK, there's a prefab instance inside my prefab. Let's open that up. So there's a game object, and now there's a reference to prefab instance 1. But we don't know this ahead of time. We actually had to do some work to see, hey, is there something additional? Then we open up prefab 1, just like we opened up prefab 2, and we notice there's only a game object in there. So now prefab 1 becomes a dynamic dependency of prefab 3, meaning you change prefab 1, prefab 3 is going to need to be re-imported as well. Other types of dynamic dependencies are things such as color space, graphics APIs, where you go from DirectX, Metal, OpenGL, Vulkan, etc. The scripting runtime version, that's also something that we mark as a dynamic dependency, because that can change, and well, your code needs to be recompiled with the new API compatibility level. Then we have the texture compression state as well, which is either uncompressed, compressed, or not supported. Now, something that I'm kind of curious about is if any of you guys are using or are making games for a platform that does not support texture compression. If somebody could raise their hand. Okay, looks like everybody is using compressed textures, or by default. Okay, that's good. And then we also store the hash of the source asset. So we go through the entire file, we get that continuous data stream, and we say, okay, let's make a hash out of that. That's some work that we needed to do, right? We didn't just know that ahead of time. So anyway, we have now built our static and our dynamic dependencies, and we have categorized the assets into the things that need to be into different collections. So now we are going to compile and give an assembly reload if there are some changes. So when I say script changes, it's actually a very, not a very, it's supposed to be a more generic word. Because we gather the DLLs, the assembly definition files, the assembly reference files, the C# scripts, the response files, where you can define where you can have global defines for your project. And we get all those and we feed that to the compilation pipeline. Then an assembly reload may happen when there are changes to your code. And it is here that we may possibly restart a refresh. And that's when you start seeing things such as iteration number something. That just means that something changed and we need to refresh once again. And if something else changes, we will need to refresh that over and over again until we get to a state that we are sure that there are no changes on disk while we're refreshing. Then comes the import part, where we run the code through native importers, scripted importers. We trigger preprocessor and postprocessor callbacks as well. And we see this bar that says importing small assets, which they are not actually that small, because that's where all your big files are. So then, once all of that happens, once the import is complete, we call postprocess all assets. This is on postprocess all assets, it's a callback. If you want to use it, you extend the asset postprocessor class. And then you get a list of assets that were imported, assets that were deleted, and then you get two lists side by side, which is the assets that moved and the location that they moved from as well. So it's here, but also usually in any scripted callback, that unintentional iterations can be triggered. For example, if inside on postprocess all assets, you are to call AssetDatabase for reserialize assets, that's going to trigger an infinite import cycle, unless you have a check that says, hey, is this the thing that I needed to check for? We have seen this, and also for importers, and that happens quite often. And the thing is, it's the script that's telling us, hey, restart or refresh, And all we can do is say, OK, yeah, well, let's restart the refresh. Then it comes in again and says, hey, restart the refresh. So we get into these situations where things just keep importing over and over again. But we hope to be able to share that information with you guys and in the documentation to hopefully allow you to debug these issues with a little bit more ease. And that's all, at least for the side where we refresh the asset database. We've looked at what happens when you scan, when you categorize assets, when scripts are compiled, when you import, and when you post-process all assets. So now, let's take that knowledge and talk about the fast platform switch. So imagine this scenario. QA found a bug on Android, but your project is currently set to PC. And it takes you at least 30 minutes to switch platforms. Now, could I have a show of hands for people, those of you whose project takes about 30 minutes to re-import? OK, that's quite a few of you. And maybe just for fun, anybody's project taking 60 minutes to switch platform? All right, all right. Well, we have some good news. But wait, QA actually found a bug on your PC, back on PC. So now you got to switch back to PC, and that's another 30 minutes to an hour to maybe longer gone. That's 1 hour out of your workday that's just being consumed by importing assets. But there's light at the end of the tunnel. So I want to get to the end, and then I want to talk about how we get to that end. The end essentially is the hash is the file name. So if you think about that statement, it's any changes that happen to your source asset or dependencies will result in a new file. When you switch platforms, you usually have one dependency that changes, which is your build target. Then the library folder is now made up of import results with the hash as their file name. And we keep these results around with the occasional garbage collection when we restart Unity. And by garbage collection, I don't mean the C# garbage collection. It's more, we look at the assets that are not used and get rid of them so your library folder doesn't infinitely keep growing as you make changes to your project. And the in-memory database will track these hashes. So now let's have a look at how we get here. We look at your file, or at the files, and we have the static dependencies and the dynamic dependencies. When you switch platform, you change the build target. Okay, that's sure, we expect that. So what we do now is we take a hash of the static dependencies and the dynamic dependencies, and we put that together as a data stream into a single hash. And we refer to that as the content hash. So the thing is, this hash actually becomes the name of your file. So any changes, well, they will generate a new file. But if there's no changes, then your file will be there on disk. And that prevents us from having to re-import your files over and over again when switching platforms. And that's going to be a big time saver for you guys. Instead of spending up to 2 hours a day re-importing, you're going to spend, well, a little bit less, maybe 1 hour. But if you have a cache server, it's going to be even more instant. So the requirements, however, are that you have already imported at least one time. That means that, so you at least import on that platform one time. So when you switch platforms back and forth, the files are already there for you. And that's going to save you some time. And like I mentioned just a few seconds ago, it works with the cache server as well. All right. So now I want to get into some of the tips and tricks of the asset database. First thing I want to talk about is what happens when I actually import what happens to the import result when I modify my asset. So we refer to the current asset database, the one that's available in 2019.2, all the way back to the beginnings of Unity as AssetDatabase v1. And for many of you, this is still going to apply if you are in an LTS version. So the artifact path, that's based on the GUID of the file, or the GUID of your asset. So for example, we can look at our prefab 3 example. We can open up the meta file, and we can see at the top, there's a GUID. If you look at the library folder, then you can map that to a particular file. So now you have, well, now you know that your asset is there. And this is because it's GUID-based. And that's kind of why we couldn't have fast platform switch before, because if you switched, we would be overwriting this asset, whereas now we use something else. So let's say I modify prefab3.prefab. So then the file, the import result is still in the same location as before. Then what happens in the AssetDatabase version 2? Well, now the artifact path is not the GUID, now it's the content hash. And if your asset changes, you're going to get a new file on disk. So the hash of prefab3 prefab is this. We modify prefab3, and naturally, we end up with a file in a different location. So this creation of new files, well, the cost of having these new files comes with the benefit of having the fast platform switch. All right, so the next thing that I would like to talk about is an experimental feature that we have called the AssetDatabase counters. We want to expose more information about the state of the AssetDatabase to you guys. So right now we have, in this particular struct, we have the import counters, which say how many assets were imported, how many refreshes happened, the number of assembly reloads, and the delta and total for each field for the application lifetime. Whereas before, the only way to look at this or find this out would be, let's parse the log, let's find out what changed. And that's not ideal, right? So now we have this information for you. And we also have it for the cache server. We have counters for how many things were uploaded and downloaded, meta files. We categorize that as well. So let's see how we use it. In this example, we have the counters from before. These are the import counters. And we want to find out how many assets were imported up to this point in time. Then I want to create a brand new and very useful test asset txt and call create asset on that. So it creates it. Then I get the counters again, and I output the new count, which is essentially one more than it was before. And this can help you track where the state of the import process for the asset database, and for your asset management systems as well. Then there's something else, which is AssetDatabase create asset. Maybe you guys have experienced that this particular API could be a little bit slow, and that's because there's a lot of callbacks. So if, for example, I have many assets and I have the paths that I want to put them in, calling this API will essentially say, okay, we need to call the pre and post processors, and we need to call on post process all assets for every single creation. That means you're calling create asset, and then you're triggering all these additional code paths. And that's the main issue. All these callbacks are being triggered. Now, there's, since we're in the tips and tricks section, there is a way to batch the creation of an asset. So that's when you call start and stop asset editing. Essentially, start asset editing puts the asset database in a waiting state. It says any operation that you do that we would have made a refresh from, we are not going to refresh right now until you tell the asset database, let's refresh again. That's what stop asset editing does. It says, now the import can begin, and everything that you've queued up is going to be imported now, which means you're only going to get one call to unpostprocess all assets instead of n calls to postprocess all assets. Now, there's something particularly important that I would like to highlight about this code, which is it's in a try and finally block. If, for some reason, create asset or the code in the try would have an exception, we would never get to stop asset editing. This is a problem because now the asset database is going to be continuously in a waiting state. And you would have to either restart Unity or, well, yeah, restart Unity or have some script that says stop asset editing without having to import it because right now nothing is going to be imported again. And that's why I want to stress that if you are going to use start and stop asset editing, please, please, please put it inside the finally block so that you don't run into these sort of issues. And the people that rely on things getting imported who are maybe not familiar with this also don't get those issues. As an added bonus, this is also going to be in the API reference documentation for some copy and paste goodness. Now, for certain workflows, you may want to ignore a folder and its contents. So this is, I guess, tip number 4. Now, I've actually looked through the forums to see, and some people have an idea, some have some guesses. And actually, adding a tilde at the end of a folder name will ignore that folder and its contents recursively. So in this case, you have assets, your materials, and materials with tilde is not going to be in your, it's not going to be imported. We just ignore that. And that's, yeah, that's what, I guess that's my last tip for today. So in summary, we have talked about how the asset database has been rewritten. We've looked at what happens when you refresh and then how that's tied to importing. We've looked at this brand new feature, which is fast platform switch and available in 19.3 beta, and we had a look at some tips and tricks. And with that, I would like to thank you for your time, and there's 2 microphones in the back if you have some additional questions. Thank you.
Okay. So, in the process of doing this, have you sped up the existing APIs in any way? For example, AssetDatabase.Get main type at path, if I remember rightly, currently causes the system to actually load the path, and that's used quite heavily in addressables, right, and causes quite a lot of performance issues there. Do you have any extra metadata, like the actual type of the asset?
Okay, so the question was, have we sped up the existing APIs, right?
Yeah.
With a
where more data needed to be stored in the asset database for that.
Okay, so in certain scenarios, we have sped it up by 16%, but in certain other scenarios, it's actually within a 2% decrease in velocity. So it changes on the use case, but in general, a refresh should be a lot faster now. Well, up to 16% faster from what we've measured.
In other words.
Hi. My question is, can we have some callbacks on new asset database when assets completed importing process, or some without any on post-process scripts?
Okay, so are you asking, as soon as it finishes importing, you would like to know when something just completed an import?
Yes, but I don't want to use like on-process commands, because I want to ask AssetDatabase import this, and when it's complete, just call the script as this method.
Okay, so well, currently we don't have such a thing. We have some new APIs that are coming out called on source asset changed, and that's being called right before we start importing a file. We have detected something, and Jonas will talk about it tomorrow. But when you say we want to have a specific callback when something finished importing, we don't have that currently, but we can always explore the possibility of having that.
Hi. I was wondering if you have these import results, won't there be a risk that they're just lingering on the hard drive and taking up space, even if you aren't changing the platform that often?
So the question was, how is my library folder just going to keep growing forever, right?
Essentially.
Okay. So what we do it's when you shut down Unity and restart it, we say which assets. Okay. We look at the things that are in the library folder, and then we see the things that are in your assets folder, and the things that are not there, we get rid of.
But won't you also keep one copy for every platform you've used, essentially?
Yeah, that would be the right thing to do. I think that's what we do, but I'd have to verify with the rest of the guys in the team about that. Okay. I can get back to you on that just in a few minutes, actually.
Hi, I have a question. We do on the initialize on load some of the new stop processing imports. Then we do some imports and do a refresh call. And we do get a warning that the package manager has a pending asset import pending, and we shouldn't call refresh database at this point, and something is wrong. Can you elaborate on that?
Okay, so I didn't quite get the question. Is that okay for you to repeat it again, please?
We, in the initialize on load editor scripts, we do some asset imports, and then we do get a warning that the package manager has a database refresh pending, and we shouldn't call in the initialize on load the AssetDatabase refresh call. Shouldn't do that, and that's some kind of error and may corrupt our database. Okay, so you're saying that you have an attribute initialize on load on a class, and with the constructor of that, you're calling AssetDatabase import or import AssetDatabase? Yeah.
Okay. And then you get a warning that says something that it may corrupt the state. Okay. So, so I'm actually not 100% sure, but some of the other guys on the team are here, so we can talk to you about that in a bit more detail. Because the way that initialize on load assets happens, it's called a little bit after we do refresh of some of the plugins, and there we do something. So, yeah, but let's talk about it after.
Hi. So with our project, we have a pretty specific issue where basically the C# files get imported in multiple passes. So first Unity compiles, then we have compiler errors which say, this file is missing or that file is not there, and then it does the reimport and then it compiles again and that works. Is that going away, or is that still going to be a thing with V2?
No, that's, okay, so the question was, if I have compile errors, the import's going to stop, and then I'm going to restart it when the compile errors are fixed, right? So the thing is, if we import things with broken scripts, which we don't, but if we were to do that, then the results you would get would be perhaps different if you have post-processor and pre-processors that are not compiled yet because of some compile error. So that would result in some non-deterministic results, and that would cause more headaches than fixing the compile issues would solve. So that's still going to be a thing in V2.
I see. Thank you.
Welcome.
Hello.
Hi.
First of all, thanks for all that cool stuff about AssetDatabase.
Yeah.
But does it have any effect on bundle building process? I mean of speeding it up, of course.
The asset bundles?
All this stuff with AssetDatabase and what you just presented.
Yeah, I'm actually not, I don't know too much about the asset bundle side of things, to be honest, but I'd be happy to connect you with somebody that might be.
All right.
Hello, I have two questions. One is there a way to find out if we are on the start of Unity or doing an asset database from start, or someone has changed an asset? So for when you call back reimport all assets.
Okay, so the question was, can we know when you're starting up Unity in terms of the asset database? Is that
Yes.
right? I would think with the asset import counters, you could check that. If you have something inside of initialize and load, you could check that the imported assets is in fact zero. That could be one way to do it.
Okay.
We have, when you start up Unity for the first time, we have a thing that says only compile scripts, but I don't think we expose that, actually. So, yeah, I'm actually not, without looking at the code, I wouldn't be able to tell you 100%, with 100% certainty if we have something that says, hey, this is the very first time Unity has started in this session. But,
yeah. And the other thing is, just a suggestion, instead of doing this try-catch thing with start editing and stop editing, I wrote a wrapper with iDisposable.
yeah.
Maybe you can also provide something like that.
Yeah, that's one of the things, right? So we could have using var current refresh and with an iDisposable. That would be a very nice, neat solution. But we also wanted to keep compatibility with V1, so that you could still have your same code working the same way with the V2 backend. So, but that is something we've actually talked about and are considering as well. But thanks for the suggestion.
Okay, thank you.
Hi. You already talked about that the import results will be the same also on different development machines. That's right.
Across machines, yes, if it's for the same target platform. So let's say I have a PC and a Mac, and my target platform is WebGL, it will result in the same content hash.
Okay. And should we now include the library folder into version control?
I would recommend against that because for two reasons. The first thing would be you're going to get a lot of deleted and added files in your change list or in your commit message. And it's just going to generate a lot of unnecessary noise. So, and then on the second part, since we have rewritten the cache server, that should be almost the way to work with the new asset database, where you have a cache server, which is a collection of all the library folders from, all the different platforms that you want to have your project for, stored on the cloud so that you can just download them from there instead of having them in version control. So that's what I would recommend, at least.
Okay, thank you.
Welcome.
Hi, you mentioned that internally, like in the create assets method, for example, that there are filters on which assets you're importing.
Yes.
Is there a way to do that in your own scripts on processing and importing to be able to filter what you're importing at any given time?
So, I mean, we have some code that does the filtering. That's all in C++. We don't expose any of that. But if you know what sort of thing you are importing, you could say, I want to import, well, you could just look for that. I'm not really sure how you would do it in C# using the asset database. I think you would need to have your own thing on top of that. Or maybe I just didn't get your question.
Okay, that's fine. Just quickly, the tilde on the file for ignoring, is that in V2 or is that in both?
So that's actually, it's not something the asset database does. That's on the virtual file system level, Unity's virtual file system. So that, at least I tested it with 19.3, but I'm pretty sure that goes back quite a while. So I would say it's a matter of trying it out.
Thank you.
Hi, I guess I have a tie-up question to the previous one. If there is a way to have a control on which assets are re-imported, because when you changing the assets, you know which assets are changing, and you don't want to trigger the refresh for the whole project.
Okay, so you want to prevent certain assets from being imported.
If there is a way to refresh like a particular asset, because I know I changed just this one, I want to refresh just this one.
Okay, yeah, that's what you would use import asset for. So if you have a change to some asset, you just call import asset on it. We create the filter, and then it says let's re-import it. So yeah, using that, you could do it. Okay.
One question.
Yeah.
You were talking about the asset server cache, like this new system in what version is it available for the server cache?
Yes.
Is it like, yeah, is it already out there? It's about just updating or?
Right. Okay. So there's a couple of things about that. We have, I think it's with beta 5, 2019-3 beta 5, where the new cache server is enabled. And we have a blog post as well from, I think, 2 weeks ago, which by now should have enabled the installation of the cache server as well. So with 19.3 beta 5, that's the first version of the asset database that you can start using the new cache server with. You can connect to it, and you can send data to it, and we log some of that information out for your convenience as well. So yeah, 19.3 beta 5.
All right. Maybe a following question, short. Yeah. It's been a little while since we set up our asset cache server. Is it recommended that you have like a cache server per project instead of like a per organization?
So the cache server now is essentially a key value store. So you can just have a central cache server, and we will send messages to it, and you will get the import results back if something has already been imported. So, and cache server per project, maybe. If you have limited resources on a machine, then yeah, I guess that would be one way to do it.
All right, thanks.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Sorry, last question about cache server. You said about this blog post with 2 weeks ago. We tried this one. It's called Unity Accelerator.
Yeah, that's
right
exactly
now.
the one, yeah.
Yeah, but the main problem for us, it actually have GUI installation. And we tried to set up on a cloud-based system. And the cloud, you cannot like use GUI to install stuff. Will it be some like a batch mode or headless version for this stuff? For installation, maybe like a previous GitHub version?
Okay, so you're saying that the installer has a problem on a particular operating
yeah,
system?
it's kind of GUI based. It's like you need to click next, next, next.
Okay, I'm not familiar with how the installer actually works. It may be able to take command line parameters, but I can ask around. Well, I can connect you with somebody that might be able to answer your question. And if that's, I mean, that sounds like it would be something that would have to work, right? So. It's, yeah, we look into that, but yeah, like I said, I could connect you with somebody if you want. Okay, I guess that was the last question. Thank you all for coming to the AssetDatabase Refresh, and see you around Unite.